There's an old saying. If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. You've probably heard it before. Maybe you even said it. It's catchy. Sounds clever. But there's a problem. History suggests something very different. There was a time when women couldn't vote. There was a time when Black Americans were threatened, beaten, and even killed for trying to vote. For decades, Indigenous people faced legal barriers that kept many from the ballot box, even after they were recognized as U.S. citizens. From poll taxes to literacy tests, grandfather clauses, intimidation, and of course, violence. And today we're still arguing over voter ID laws, district maps, early voting, absentee ballots, and who should have access to the polls. So here's the question. If voting doesn't matter, why has so much of American history been spent deciding who gets to do it? Today we're following the evidence to find out whether your vote is powerless, or whether convincing you that it is has become one of the most powerful political messages of all. Welcome to You Oughta Know Betta, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. Every episode, we take a claim that's become accepted as fact, hold it up to the light, and ask a simple question. What does the evidence say? Today's claim is one you've probably heard 100 times. My vote doesn't matter. It's a sentence that gets repeated every election cycle. Sometimes it's said out of frustration. Sometimes it's said without confidence. Sometimes it's said with confidence. Sometimes it's used to explain why someone isn't voting at all. And honestly, I get it. People watch politicians make promises they never seem to keep. They see gridlock in Congress. They see money pouring into campaigns. They see headlines about lobbyists, special interests, and billionaires. After enough disappointment, it's easy to start wondering whether ordinary people have any influence at all. That's a fair question. But a fair question deserves an honest investigation. So today, we're not going to tell you what to believe. We're going to put the claim on trial, and you make your own decision. Let's start somewhere unexpected. Not in Washington, not at a polling place, inside your head. In the late 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman began researching a concept that would become known as learned helplessness. His work suggested that when people repeatedly believe their actions won't change the outcome, they become less likely to participate, less likely to act, even when opportunities to make a difference exist. Now let's be clear about something. I'm not saying voting is the same thing as Seligman's research. It isn't. What I am saying is that our expectations shape our behaviors. If you believe studying won't help, you're less likely to study. If you believe exercising won't improve your health, you're less likely to exercise. And if you believe your voice doesn't matter, you're much less likely to use it. Psychologists have spent decades studying how beliefs influence behavior. And one of the most consistent findings is that people are less likely to act when they think their actions are meaningless. That idea doesn't just apply to politics, it applies to life. Now, political scientists have a name for this. It's called political efficacy. Political efficacy is your belief that you can understand politics and that government can respond to people like you. There are two kinds: of political efficacy: internal and external. Internal political efficacy is believing you're capable of understanding issues well enough to participate. External political efficacy is believing that your participation can actually influence the government. Why does that matter? Because decades of research, including studies from the American National Election Studies, have found that people with higher political efficacy are more likely to vote, contact elected officials, attend public meetings, volunteer, and even participate in civic life. Think about that for a second. The belief itself changes the behavior. Not because the belief magically changes the world, but because it changes whether people engage with it. So before we've even looked at a single election, we've already had our first piece of evidence. The idea that your actions don't matter has consequences all by itself. Now let's leave psychology for a second and let's talk about history. Because history is a funny way of exposing those bad arguments. If voting never mattered, why did so many people spend so much time trying to control who could do it? The United States didn't begin as a democracy where everyone had an equal voice. In the early years of the country, voting was largely limited to white men who owned property. The belief was simple. If you didn't own land, you didn't have enough of a stake in society to help govern it. That changed, eventually. Property requirements began disappearing. Then came the Civil War. In 1870, the 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. On paper, it was a monumental step forward. But paper and ideology aren't always the same thing. Across the South, states found new ways to keep Black Americans away from the ballot box without openly violating the Constitution. Poll taxes forced people to pay before they could vote. Literacy tests were admitted unfairly, often with impossible questions, or selectively enforced. Grandfather clauses exempted many white voters while excluding the descendants of enslaved people. And when those barriers weren't enough, there was intimidation, violence, economic retaliation. People lost jobs for trying to register. Families were threatened. Some were beaten. Some were murdered. Not because they committed a crime, because they tried to vote. Women faced a different fight. For decades, they organized, protested, marched, and were arrested, demanding a voice in the government that made laws affecting their lives. That struggle led to the 19th Amendment in 1920, which prohibited denying the vote on the basis of sex. Indigenous Americans faced barriers as well. Although Congress passed the, quote, Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, recognizing indigenous people as U.S. citizens, many states continued to block them from voting through state laws and practices. In some places, those barriers remained in place for decades. And then came the Civil Rights Movement. Americans watched peaceful protesters attacked with dogs, beaten with clubs, sprayed with fire hoses. In 1965, hundreds of voting rights marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. They were met with brutal violence by law enforcement and what we call today Bloody Sunday. Those images shocked the nation. Later that year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most significant civil rights laws in American history. It outlawed many discriminatory voting practices and gave the federal government new authority to enforce voting rights. So let's pause the trial for a moment. Because history has given us something to think about. If voting truly didn't matter, why were people willing to risk everything to gain that right? And on the other side, why were others willing to risk everything to take it away? Those questions aren't rhetorical. They're evidence. Because throughout American history, access to the ballot has never been treated like something meaningless. It's been treated like power. And people don't spend centuries fighting over something that has no value. So far, we've touched on two things. Psychology tells us that when people believe their actions don't matter, they're less likely to act. History tells us that generations of Americans fought, sometimes with their lives, for the right to vote. But there's still one question hanging over this entire case. Even if voting has mattered throughout history, does my vote matter today? It's probably the most common question people ask. And honestly, it's the wrong question. Because democracy never depended on one person. Depended on millions of people making the exact same decision. To participate, think about a football game. No one player wins the game by themselves. But if half the team decides not to show up, the outcome changes before the game even begins. Democracy works the same way. The power isn't in one vote. The power is in millions of Americans' votes collected together. So instead of asking whether one vote can change everything, let's ask a better question. Can enough people believing their vote doesn't matter change anything? Absolutely. That's the answer to that question. Absolutely. And we have the proof. In election after election, we find races decided by incredibly small margins, not just for president, for mayors, school board members, judges, sheriffs, city councils, state legislatures. In 2017, a race for Virginia's House of Delegates ended in an exact tie. Not close, a tie. After every ballot had been counted and recounted, the winner wasn't decided by another vote. It was decided by a drawing of a name from a bowl. That single seat determined control of the chamber. One seat, one random drawing, one government that looked very different than it would have if just one more voter had shown up. And that's not an isolated story. Across the country, local elections have been decided by single digits, by a handful of votes, and sometimes by just one. Those races rarely make national headlines, but they determine things you actually experience every day. Who funds your school, repairs your roads, prosecutes the crimes, oversees your elections, who redraws your districts, who decides your tax rates, who appoints the officials to boards and commissions. These are decisions that shape your community long after the campaign signs disappear. So maybe we've been measuring the wrong thing. We've been asking whether one vote is powerful enough to change America. But democracy doesn't work like a light switch. It works like a mosaic. One piece doesn't make the picture. But without enough pieces, there is no picture at all. So far, we've answered one question. Does voting matter? Well, history says yes. Psychology says believing your voice doesn't matter changes your behavior. And modern elections remind us that participation still shapes outcomes. But there's another argument that comes up just as often. They're all the same. It's a phrase we've all heard. Maybe you've said it yourself. Usually it doesn't come from apathy. It comes from disappointment. People get tired of campaign promises that never seem to become reality. They watch elected officials argue while problems remain unsolved. They see headlines about corruption, lobbyists, and political donations. After enough of that, it's understandable to ask, does it even matter who's in office? That's an important question. But let's be careful not to confuse two different ideas. You can believe every candidate is imperfect. That doesn't mean every candidate is identical. Those aren't the same claim. Think about your own life. You may not love every restaurant in your town. That doesn't mean they all serve the same food. You may not like every doctor. That doesn't mean every doctor gives the same treatment. The existence of flaws doesn't erase differences. And the same is true in government. Different presidents appoint different judges, different governors sign different budgets, different state legislatures pass different laws. Different district attorneys decide which cases to prosecute. Different school boards adopt different policies. Those decisions have real consequences. Whether you agree with them or not, whether you voted for them or not, the evidence is all around us. Changes in tax policy, environmental regulations, reproductive rights, criminal justice, education, labor protections, healthcare. Those aren't theoretical differences. They're policy decisions made by people elected to public office. So maybe the better question isn't, are politicians all the same? Maybe it's, what happens when we stop paying attention to the differences? All right. So we've talked about psychology. We've talked about history. We talked about close elections. Let's ask, what might be the most important question of this episode? Who benefits when people stop participating? Notice I didn't ask who benefits when people vote for one party or another. I asked, who benefits when people stop participating altogether? Because those are two very different questions. In every democracy, elected officials are chosen by the people who show up. Not by everyone who could have voted, by everyone who actually does. Imagine a town with 10,000 eligible voters. Election day comes around and only 4,000 people cast a ballot. The winners don't represent 10,000 voices. They represent the choices made by 4,000. The other 6,000 didn't lose their right to vote. They simply just chose not to use it. Government didn't stop functioning because they stayed home. Budgets were still passed. Judges were still elected. School board members still took office. New laws were still written. Life moved on. Just moved on without their participation. And that's the part that I think we overlook. When people say, I'm not voting because my voice doesn't matter, they're usually trying to send a message. But elections don't measure silence. They measure ballots. There isn't a box you can check that says, I'm dissatisfied with every candidate. There isn't a column on the election results that say 5 million people stayed home because they felt ignored. History records who voted. It records who won. Doesn't record why someone decided not to participate. And that's important because refusing to vote doesn't freeze the system. It doesn't cancel the election. It doesn't erase the outcome. It simply means someone else is making the decision without your input. Think about it this way. Imagine your city is holding a meeting to decide whether a new school should be built in your neighborhood. Everyone is invited. You decide not to go because you don't think anyone will listen anyway. The meeting happens. The vote is taken. The decision is made. Whether you were in the room or not, the outcome still affects your family. That's democracy. It keeps moving. The only question is whether you're helping steer it. Now, does that mean every elected official will do exactly what you want? Of course not. It's never been the promise of democracy. The promise isn't that you'll always get your way. The promise is that you'll always have the opportunity to help decide the direction. That's a very different thing and extremely important. Throughout American history, people have marched, organized, petitioned, litigated, and in some cases died for the chance to have that opportunity. Not because they believed every election would solve their problems, but because they understood something we sometimes forget. Influence isn't guaranteed. It's exercised. The more people who believe they don't matter, the fewer people participate. And the fewer people who participate, the easier it becomes for a smaller group to shape decisions that affect everyone else. That's not a partisan statement. That's how representative government works. Democracy doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes it weakens one person at a time. One person deciding they're too busy, too discouraged, or that their voice doesn't matter, until eventually millions of people have made the same decision. And by then, the lie has already done exactly what it was capable of doing. It kept people home. Now, at the beginning of this episode, we put a single claim on trial. My vote doesn't matter. We didn't answer that claim with campaign slogans. We didn't answer it with party talking points or bumper stickers. We answered it with evidence. Psychology showed us that when people believe their actions have no effect, they're less likely to act. Researchers call it learned helplessness. And political scientists have spent decades studying a related concept called political efficacy, the belief that ordinary people can influence government. Again and again, the research points in the same direction. What we believe about our own power influences whether we use it. History gave us another piece of evidence. If voting didn't matter, why were so many people denied the right to do it? Why were poll taxes created, literacy tests, intimidation, violence? Why did generations of Americans march, organize, go to jail, and in some cases lose their lives to protect a right that supposedly had no value? History doesn't support the idea that voting is meaningless. It tells a very different story. Then we looked at it today. We found elections decided by razor-thin margins. We found local races that shape our schools, our neighborhoods, our courts, our communities. We found that government keeps moving whether we participate or not. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. The question has never been whether government will make decisions. It will. The question is whether you'll have a voice in deciding who makes them. Now, does voting solve every problem? No. Does every promise become reality? No. Will every election leave everyone satisfied? Of course not. Democracy has never been about guarantees. It's about participation. It's about accepting that while no single voice can speak for everyone, every voice deserves the chance to be heard. And every voice deserves the chance to speak for itself. So, what verdict did we reach? Is it true that one vote changes every election? No. The evidence doesn't support that. But does the evidence support the idea that your vote doesn't matter? I don't believe it does. In fact, I think the evidence tells us something entirely different. The belief that your voice doesn't matter can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people who believe it, the fewer people participate. The fewer people who participate, the fewer voices are represented. And the fewer voices that are represented, the easier it becomes for a smaller number of people to decide the future for everyone else. It's not a flaw unique to one political party. It's the reality of representative government. So maybe the biggest threat to democracy isn't disagreement. Maybe it isn't polarization, although it plays a big part. Maybe it isn't even the candidates themselves, no matter how loud they may be. Maybe it's convincing ordinary people that they have no reason to participate at all. Because democracy doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for participation. And history reminds us that every generation inherits rights that it didn't have to fight for. The question is whether we'll value them enough to keep using them. I'm AJ Miller, and this has been You Oughta Know Betta, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Until next time, stay curious, ask better questions, and don't let anyone else decide your voice isn't worth hearing. Good night.